reConstruct Bible Study. If you'd like to join us for the journey, you can get all of the details that you need, daily readings, and all of the explanatory notes right there at that URL at the bottom of your screen. go.christtable.today/reconstruct. We would love to have you along for the ride. Today here in Florida, we are expecting the birth of a hurricane on our shores, and so it's a little crazy here. Hopefully the power won't go out before the end of this broadcast, and we'll see if we're able to be with you tomorrow. But I'm glad that you're here with us today as we jump into Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 through 19. So let's dig in. It is a big day in the Bible study because the wall is finally finished. Now, what the text means by the wall is finally finished, we aren't exactly certain, but clearly it's a big day. Maybe there were still things to be done on the wall, but it is at a point where Nehemiah and the people are able to say, we are at a point that this thing is done. And what, if anything, is left over is just icing on the cake. And so they're going to celebrate this in a big way. But what we find out today is that, as we've said, there always seems to be, every single time there is a step forward or something to celebrate, there is an equal and opposite pattern of pushback. We're not sure why that is, if it just happens that way, or it could also be a storytelling device. These are Nehemiah's memoirs that have been pulled together either by Nehemiah or more likely by somebody else and kind of packaged into this book alongside Ezra. Either way, though, it is absolutely incredible that, as it says here in verse 15, that after just 52 days of having begun, they had finished the wall. That means the removal of debris. That means re-prepping the site for the wall to go up. That means getting everybody and everything in order, and then doing so under all of the pushback that they have been receiving from outside of Jerusalem as well as inside of Jerusalem. So this is quite a feat. Some might even call it a miracle. In fact, there in verse 16, as Nehemiah continues, when our enemies and the surrounding nations heard about it, they were frightened and humiliated, and they realized that this had been done with the help of our God. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, but as we've said multiple times, it is clear to us that Nehemiah has leveraged God and his statement of God's involvement in the project to great effect in order to motivate and to continue to center the people on the narrative that this isn't Nehemiah's wall, but that this is God's wall. And so all of the work that they are putting in, all of the extra hours, all of the money that they have lost, the crops that have laid and gone to waste, the children that have been sold into indentured servitude in order to continue to support this, all of these things, Nehemiah continues to remind them, isn't work for Nehemiah or Jerusalem or for the wall. This is work for God, which is a very compelling argument, which is often unprovable. And so it's so unbelievably important that we not leverage or place into God's mouth words that he may or may not given. I think, I have a lot of difficulty in the text here in Nehemiah whenever Nehemiah continually uses the phrase, this is for God, this is what God wants, this is what God does. But then the ways in which Nehemiah goes about accomplishing the building of the wall, the treatment of the enemies, etc., don't really fully comport to what God has said in his law or the ways things are supposed to be done. That's a disconnect that is very telling. And so I always feel like it is much better to not leverage God as being the one who wants something done or is pressing for something to be done. unless we're absolutely certain it is. And even then, what's the need? If it's of God, it will happen. People will want to be a part, right? Well, we would hope so. If not, let's make sure it's of God, just in case it isn't. But there's something here in this verse 16 that just caught my eye, that the enemies and the people who were outside of Jerusalem, so enemies probably means people who were inside of Jerusalem, when the wall was finished, were frightened and humiliated. These are two very interesting statements for Nehemiah to make about the response. He doesn't note here that the people are celebrating, that the people are excited or happy. Maybe they weren't, but let's, for the sake of argument, assume that they were. It seems as though Nehemiah is solely focused on beating the dissent, proving them wrong. Nehemiah very much seems to be on a mission that isn't so much a mission to accomplish what God wants, but seems to be a mission to goad the resistance, to make a statement, not to God, but to the enemies. Don't know that they were God's enemies, though Nehemiah has painted them in that way, but they are certainly Nehemiah's enemies. But the humiliation, maybe, if they did not want the wall to be built and had worked very hard for the wall not to be built, then those inside Jerusalem, inside the tribe, as well as those who were not Israelites, humiliation may well be a right response. Frightened, though. Frightened. Why would they have been frightened? Maybe because God helped. Why would they be frightened at God helping the wall? Why would a wall frighten them? Unless there was a sense among people inside and outside the city that the reasons behind rebuilding the wall were not completely forthright or God-honoring. Why would they be frightened? Perhaps they thought that Israel was going to mount up an army and try to use it as a base to take other territories. Perhaps they were concerned that Israel would try to take their land back from Persia. Perhaps they thought that they would use this wall to prevent others from access to the resources within the city. What's mine is mine, and what's not yours is mine too, and what's yours may be mine if I can get it behind the wall. I don't know, it's all conjecture, but I think that the word frightened is a word that we have to contend with, and that tells us a lot more than maybe Nehemiah's words tell us. So during those 52 days, Nehemiah says, many letters went back and forth between Tobiah and the nobles of Judah. Tobiah, the resistance, the nobles of Judah being the people who were the bigwigs in Jerusalem. So for many in Judah had sworn allegiance to Tobiah because of his father-in-law. His father-in-law was Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan was married to the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. So there are connections between these people who Tobiah sees as the resistance and hates, and people inside the city who don't see Tobiah in the same way and with the same vehemence that Nehemiah clearly does. They kept telling me, the nobles, about Tobiah's good deeds, and then they told him everything that I said, and Tobiah kept sending threatening letters to intimidate me. Now, this sounds like an elementary school squabble, frankly, but whenever adults participate in such things, especially adults in leadership or in resources or who have resources, it gets really super messy, right? So on one side, Nehemiah is like Tobiah is the enemy. Tobiah is the spawn of Satan. There is absolutely nothing good, and we're not going to give him any involvement, input, grace, mercy at all. But then there are people who are insiders who have a soft spot for Tobiah, and this is a situation for Nehemiah. It's a problem because Nehemiah does not want there to be split allegiance. For him, it's a zero-sum game. If Tobiah has influence or a voice into the community and into people in leadership in Jerusalem, then from Nehemiah's space, from where Nehemiah sits, that is a voice or influence that Nehemiah himself doesn't have and should have. And so it's a mess. You see this happen lots of times where people on both sides believe that they are right. One or both sides may even believe that they have the blessing of God for being right, that God is on their side. Now, clearly, Nehemiah thinks that here. We're not sure whether or not Tobiah thinks that God is on his side, but we clearly think that we clearly know that Tobiah thinks that he is right. Whenever one person believes that they have God on their side and that they are an agent of God, that's a whole other level of dispute. Whenever both of them do, that's a recipe for disaster. What do? How do you determine whether or not somebody is in the right or the wrong? Oftentimes, I think that in those instances, we decide badly who is right or who is wrong. It's the person who speaks the best. It's the person who has wooed us or bought our trust. It oftentimes is the person who is most like us. Maybe they're from where we're from. Maybe their skin color is our skin color. Maybe the gender is the same. We have ways in which we determine whenever both sides say that they are right. We have ways in which we determine who's right and who's wrong. And I would suggest that most of those ways that we traditionally use are wrong, are not good ways to determine whether somebody is in the right or somebody is in the wrong when it comes especially to something that is subjective. Whose side is God on? That's a question that I'm not going to answer, but it is a question that I'd like you to wrestle with. And if you have the study guide, then you have that question today as your last question is how do you decide? I'd love to know what you think. If you don't have a study guide, then I'll just ask you outright here. How do you decide who is right and who is wrong whenever both sides say they're right and one or more sides say God is on their side? How do you determine it? This was a situation, actually, and we'll close with this, that David found himself in with Saul in the Old Testament. The story, which you may or may not know, involves the king, Saul, and David, the next king who has been blessed, anointed by God to be the king, are in conflict for years with each other. So much so that it was probably hard for everybody on the outside to tell in each and every one of the squabbles who is right and who is wrong. Was there blame on both sides? Was there rightness on both sides? But how do we decide? And more importantly, how do we decide which side God is on? Whenever both people seem to be on God's side and saying that God is on their side, that can be difficult to determine. And I love this line. 1 Samuel 24:12. David says, "May the Lord judge. May the Lord judge between you and me." And oftentimes at the end of the day, unfortunately, that is the best that we can do, is recognize that we are ultimately unable to judge in these messy, chaotic moments and situations, and it must be left up to God. The question is, Can we leave it up to God? That's difficult at best. Until tomorrow, happy reading.